So unsurprisingly, I watched the season 8 premiere of Game of Thrones this week, and I had some thoughts. Not about necessarily the characters or the plot or any of the things I should have been thinking about, but I'm a little preoccupied right now for reasons that I've been told to stop talking about with story construction and also parallel story arcs and how to set them up and keep people in the right frame of mind when you switch between lots of different characters, and nothing switches between lots of different characters like Game of Thrones, and it does it really well. You gotta freshen up people's minds, you gotta tell them what is the thing they should be thinking about, and you have to re-emphasize a lot of times attributes of characters so that people know what they need to be taking forward. And you have to keep everybody abreast of all of these situations and how these characters are interacting with each other and feeling about each other, while also providing a compelling story. And that's part of a compelling story, but it's not the whole thing, right? So you have to do all this stuff. It's hard to do. And I'm currently hyper aware of how hard it is to do, because I'm trying to do it. So in part, as an exercise as a writer to help me understand how this is done, and in part, just because I'm a fan, I think it's amazing how they do this stuff. Obviously, I think there's a lot to learn just by sort of taking this whole episode apart with a fine-toothed comb. But I also think that there is a particular bit that is extremely fascinating that gives us a lot of information about how this is done. And so, I would like to talk about the last 2 lines in every scene of Season 8, Episode 1 of Game of Thrones, and what they made me think about and what I think they're doing. There are 19 scenes in this episode as I have counted them. Now, of course, you can find wibbly there, but I'm basically saying a scene is like a setting change that happens abruptly, not like through a pan of the camera, different characters talking. That's how I'm defining a scene. There are some micro scenes as well that I've kind of excluded, but you know, these are the moments that we are most likely to take with us. And as they set up the next scene, as they do establishing shots, as they introduce characters, we have time to process those last few words that are said. This is also what is done in books with chapter breaks or other kinds of breaks in text. Give the person a moment to think about what has just been said and let them know that that is an important thing. So, let's get started. Scene 1, the march into Winterfell, where we establish the existence of a lot of characters and show that they are now coming to a place that is very new. It is the longest scene in the episode at 5 minutes and 52 seconds. And here are the last 2 lines of that scene.
Winterfell is yours, Your Grace.
We don't have time for all this. The Night King has your dragon. He's one of them now.
This is the first time that the Stark siblings have met Daenerys Targaryen. We are establishing Sansa as an amazing character in a way that we haven't seen before. And Bran is also doing a fantastic job of being exactly what he needs to be. And we are reminded that this is the first time these characters have interacted, and we are reminded that they have different interests. Daenerys wants to be queen, Sansa wants there to be independence in the north and is frustrated by the idea that we've lost that. That's being set up very clearly. And Bran is like, you guys need to shut the fuck up about this. The White Walkers are coming. It also sets something up that we see a lot when we look at Game of Thrones, especially this episode in detail, which is that a great deal of information is being conveyed by looking at each other. Words are not being said. Lots of glances. Lots of very meaningful gazes. Scene number 2, we're in the hall at Winterfell and people are arguing with each other. And what we set up here, let's find out.
What do dragons eat, anyway?
Whatever they want.
The big dynamic again. Sansa and Dany are having it out, and they're doing it in a great way, and I like it a lot, how it's set up, and the dynamic, and they are both very strong characters, and I'm living for it. But here's what we're taking away. They're both badass, and they are both ultimately in it for good of people, but it seems like we're kind of setting up Dany to be a little bit of a shit. We're also establishing a primary conflict here. At the end of the last season, it seemed like maybe everything's gonna be okay. If they could just get together, then the Game of Thrones is over and things are good, but Sansa gets to come in here and have this perspective and also be like kind of have us on our side. Like the show is setting us up to feel like we're on her side, because, you know, Daenerys is being really entitled and, you know, queeny and like too much power. It seems like kind of corrupty. And so like her having this very good perspective and a good reason to not love this is creating a new tension, and it is pulling Jon in two different directions, which is really important because otherwise we don't have this tension. So that's being set up very quickly in these first two scenes. Scene number 3, Sansa and Tyrion. And again, my friends, let's see what we get to take away from this one.
She has something to live for now. I believe she wants to survive.
I used to think you were the cleverest man alive.
We have set up through this entire series that Tyrion Lannister is a very cunning, smart guy. This is a thing that we know about him. He is really smart. The fact that, one, we, the audience, know that Cersei is not sending her armies north, and thus we know that Sansa is right about this. This is really going a long way to set up how the audience now needs to expect Sansa to be cunning, amazing, smart, better at any of this, and like independent. Like she would have just sort of gone with what Tyrion thought not long ago. And now she's like, oh wow, no, I see very clearly that you were wrong about this. That's what we're carrying out of this initial part of the episode that is about the politics at Winterfell. We are taking out of that Sansa Stark is better at this than Tyrion Lannister. That's a really good setup. And then finally we end our first block at Winterfell with the reunion of Arya and Jon. 2 minutes and 9 seconds, so pretty quick. I could have done with more of it. And so what do we take out of this one?
I'm a family too.
Don't forget that.
One, it's giving the audience like a time to feel like, oh, but I know that he isn't, which is gonna make the audience feel good. It's gonna give us that sort of like rush of like, oh, this reveal is coming. But it's also giving us like, this is family. Like whether or not they are genetically like brother and sister, like they were raised together, they love each other, this is a really wonderful dynamic that like the audience is going to really enjoy, because like familial love is obviously a big part of people's lives, and you get to carry that out of this and feel really good and supportive of the Starks and of Winterfell when we leave Winterfell and arrive at the setup of Cersei Lannister. We get a micro scene here of Cersei and Qyburn, and it's 22 seconds long, so here's how it ends.
The dead have broken through the wall.
Good.
Yeah, so like this, we've set up that like Jon and Arya are love hug good, and Sansa's badass, and Dany's also pretty great, and then that. And so we've set up Cersei, and now it's time to set up Euron. What do we take from our meeting with Euron and Yara in this scene that is a minute and 50 seconds long and is composed almost entirely of long, meaningful staring at each other?
You picked the losing side.
Then I'll serve the Iron Fleet somewhere else. But first, I'm gonna fuck the Queen.
So we've got terrible person and terrible person. We're setting them up to be bad, and they're gonna go do this now. Scene number 7 of the episode, if you include that micro scene earlier. It's 2 minutes and 40 seconds long, and it's intolerable the whole time. This scene doesn't end with dialogue. We could say that the last lines in the scene are this.
I've executed men for less.
They were lesser men.
But that's not the last lines in the scene, because what we're actually taking away from it is this knowing, like, over-the-shoulder glance from Cersei to Euron, and then he comes and he gets to walk past the big scary zombie, and then into the Queen's chambers. Scene number 8, Bronn and Qyburn, and lots of Game of Thrones nudity. Gotta have some of that in there. This is just a pure setup scene. It's to create tension and set something up that's gonna go into a future episode. Mostly what we take out of it is like, keep in mind that that's a thing. Bron's got a crossbow.
What will she do for the man who rids her of her treasonous brothers?
And now we move on to post-coital Euron and Cersei Lannister. Ay, ay, ay.
Now I want to be alone.
I'm going to put a prince in your belly.
God. So at least two things are happening here. We are reminding us that Cersei was pregnant, was pretending to be pregnant. Does she have Jaime's baby inside of her? We're not sure, but we're reminding us that that's a thing. And then I'm like, but she's drinking wine. And it's like, this is the Middle Ages. This is not, and also it's Cersei Lannister. Like, she's not careful. But we end the scene on a long shot of Cersei looking like just deeply regretful and upset and sad, which ultimately she is. It's important to remember that like her evil comes from a deep well of despair. Wherever that began, it certainly has had plenty of fuel in the last few years. We need those moments where we see this person as a human being, not necessarily feeling bad for what she's doing or what she's done. She doesn't seem to have any of that, but having like some kind of place where this comes from. And you see it in her face just there. Somewhat hard to do on the written page, but still lessons to learn there for sure. Yara and Theon. We get this transition. We're still kind of amongst the Greyjoys, but we get this transition where like we're breaking out. It's great, very exciting. Yara and Theon then get to have a conversation, and we get to see this like broken man with his very strong and good sister. They're getting out from under Euron's thumb, which is great because Euron has just gotten something that he wants, but now he's lost something, which makes us feel good. But the thing that we're ending on in this 2-minute and 19-second long scene, which is the 10th scene in this episode of Game of Thrones.
His dead may never die.
But kill the bastards anyway.
We're getting good. We're getting good feels. We're gonna have another main character at Winterfell doing a thing. We're thinking about the history of the character of Theon Greyjoy. We're getting some time to do that. We're thinking about the history of the Iron Islands and their religion and their understanding of the world. That's really nice. And we're also getting this more familial, huggy love, even a reflection of the earlier hug that we had between Arya and Jon, which is great because Theon, in a way, is a Stark as well as being a Greyjoy, and he is paid so deeply for what he's done, and we get time to think about that as well. Varys, Davos, and Tyrion up on the wall watching Jon and Dany. This scene is 2 minutes and 4 seconds long. Here's what we take away.
Respect is how the young keep us at a distance, so we don't remind them of an unpleasant truth.
What is that?
Nothing lasts.
Okay, it was nearly there. I feel like something bad happened in the writer's room here. No reason to be this explicit. We don't need you to explain, Varys. The idea that Tyrion Lannister would not know what the unpleasant truth is here. Like, you know, he's a very smart guy. This feels uncharacteristic to me and I don't like it. But I do think that it is a great way to end a scene. So we're seeing a few different ways to end scenes here. But this way is new. It's a new way to end a scene where like we're talking about the characters, but we're also talking about something bigger than the characters. We're talking about like an actual insight that this situation is providing for me as a human being. And that is a really great thing to do because then the audience is thinking about like the broader context of this story outside of this world and inside of ours. That's really cool. I like it a lot. I don't like how sort of ham-fisted it ended up having to be. And now we transition down from the battlements to lovers as they discuss and then go on a dragon ride. For the second longest scene in this episode of Game of Thrones, it's kind of several different scenes and like doesn't have a lot to go on at the end here, but let's show you this.
Don't be afraid.
This scene ends with glances instead of with words, as is not uncommon, apparently. It's not super helpful for me trying to figure out the right time and place to end a chapter. Also, I think it kind of falls flat a little bit. A lot of this scene is about like trying to like amp up the chemistry between Jon and Dany, and like I think it does that okay, but it also there's a lot of levity, there's a lot of jokey that doesn't quite come across because Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen are such serious characters. Anyway, the ending, if we're gonna call this dialogue, here it is. It's Jon Snow kissing his girlfriend in front of a dragon and the dragon looking at him. I don't know what I'm supposed to take away from this one. I feel like it's a missed opportunity. This is your chance to establish something, and it's a very long scene that ends with a joke, kind of, I guess. Scene number 13, Gendry, Sandor, and Arya and the blacksmithing area. There's kind of three scenes in this scene. You got Gendry and Sandor, you got Sandor and Arya, and then you got Arya and Gendry. But like in total, this is how the scene ends.
It's Valyrian steel. I always knew you were just another rich girl.
You don't know any other rich girls?
More Stark sister badassery, very good joke, good chemistry there, setting up maybe us thinking like, well, could Arya and Gendry actually be a thing? And if so, would that be bad? Like maybe that wouldn't be bad. And so they're putting that on the page there. It's been around, but they're putting it on the page for us to think about, and also putting Arya in a place where it doesn't seem as weird because she's more grown up, she's very confident, she understands her own power a little bit, and well, a little bit, definitely. More than a little bit. But flirtation's always a good way to end a scene because it sets up future relationship dynamic. Jon and Sansa talk for 2 minutes now. Let's see how they end this conversation.
Did you bend the knee to save the North? Or because you love her?
Hank, you only included one line. You didn't include the response. That's because the response wasn't included. This is a trick that I almost hesitate to discuss, because if you start noticing it, you start noticing it a lot, and you realize that it isn't so much a narrative trick, it is a story trick. So it doesn't actually make sense. Jon would answer this question. Jon doesn't just have Sansa ask him this very important question and then turn around and walk away. The conversation continues, but we're not supposed to think about the conversation continuing, and this is a thing that is being done to us by the edit. We don't think, how would that conversation have continued to progress? We think, what is the answer to that question? That question is being posed to the audience as well as to Jon Snow. It's giving us, me and Jon, something this important thing to think about. I don't know that answer. And neither does Jon probably, and it's probably not that simple, but it's important to see Sansa thinking about this in a really critical way. It sets that up really well, but it also, if you notice when questions go unanswered in narrative, especially in television, but also this happens in books, chapters will end on questions. I've done it. Chapters end on questions that would be answered, but don't get answered because this is part of the storytelling, not I am faithfully reproducing a conversation as it would actually occur. This is a really good use of it. Sometimes I feel like it's overdone and too much. But in this case, I don't know, I feel like they should have a name for this because it feels like I see it all the time. But in this case, I think that it does give me a lot to think about, and I don't know what Jon's answer would be. And I think that Jon's answer would probably be I'm not sure. I don't know. It's both of those things ultimately. And that's not an interesting conversation to keep having. And that would eliminate some of this tension and also eliminate the fact that this isn't a question that is being posed to get at an answer. It's being posed so that we understand that the question is there and we understand that Sansa is perceptive enough to pick up on it. Really good. Dany and Jorah and Sam. Ooh, gosh. So Sam's finally here, for one thing, and this reveal, thus, like, this scene is kind of set up as like, we are now gonna get into the reveal. Is it gonna happen now? No, but it might happen soon. So, but what a beautiful scene. Let's see how it ends.
Thank you, Your Grace, for telling me. May I?
Of course.
This gives us so much to think about as we transition out of this scene. We're thinking about Sam's loss, about the fact that this is a complicated loss because he never had a great relationship with his dad, but also that, like, you know, also his brother is dead. But also it gives us that moment to see Daenerys seeing the impact of what she does on a real person and a real good person, and one of our favorite people as fans of Game of Thrones. And we also are setting Sam up to not be sympathetic to her because she's just killed his brother and didn't even really know. And then you also have this time to think about the fact that Sam is like standing in front of the murderer of his family, but she's the most powerful person in the world. And so there's also that dynamic sitting there on the page for us to contemplate as we move into these shots as Sam transitions to a different scene. Chapter 16, as not actually chapters. And I don't like this isn't directly analogous to chapters, of course. These are far fewer words than you would have in a chapter, but I think in a storytelling way, there's good analogs here. How does this scene end?
You're his brother. Shouldn't you tell him?
I'm not his brother. He trusts you more than anyone. Now's the time.
This is a scene purely to transition to Sam and Jon, and it's just amping us up for this big reveal. I wish there was a good way to do this in like book writing. I don't know how to do it, how to create something this short. I guess you could do it like in a book situation. This whole, like, everything that has Sam in it here would be a chapter. So Sam talks to Dany and Jorah. Sam runs out. Sam runs into to Bran, and then he finds the crypt, and he finds Jon in the crypt, and like there'd be a lot more on the page because, like, how does Sam know where Jon is? He just figures it out. It's off the screen, and we all assume that there's a way to do it. Who the fuck is calling me over and over again? Oh, it's a phone call I'm supposed to be on. And now is the time. Bran said so. We're gonna have our 4-minute and 9-second third longest scene in the show. Sam and Jon have the talk. What are the last 2 lines of the scene?
You gave up your crown to save your people. Would she do the same?
We did it again! Sam asked Jon Snow a question, and Jon Snow didn't answer the question. Jon Snow did give a look, though. And in this way, at least there is an answer, which is that I need to think about that. Like, so I still, like, this isn't a natural conversation. Like, how do Jon and Sam walk out of this tomb together? Like, what does the conversation continue? We don't think about that as viewers. So we have a second instance of this thing happening where this question is being put into Jon Snow's head. We have seen through this episode Sansa being amazing, Jon Snow, being somewhat at the whim of this wonderful and terrifying person, Daenerys Targaryen. So we end with Jon Snow and us, the audience, thinking about this huge question. Not only is she maybe not the best person to have this job, though she certainly has this sort of temperament, but maybe she also isn't the person who rightfully deserves it. And like Jon Snow, somebody that a lot of people have wanted to take it even though he isn't the rightful heir, is. That's a lot to think about. That's sort of the end of the dramatic arc, and then now we have 2 scenes that are, sort of driving plot forward. So we'll discuss them. And also, neither of these scenes really end with dialogue. So let's see them. Scene number 18, the Umber Boy. 3 minutes and 47 seconds long. It's bad. I'm not even gonna put it up on the screen. So here's just the audio because it's a little too graphic for me to want to put on my YouTube channel.
Get there before they're dead. We just have to hope the Night King doesn't come first.
So those are the lines. We're in the middle of sort of a logistical conversation, and then the Umber boy gets a line. Again, sorry, what happened to you? And then we have a very long shot of a fiery spiral. What does it mean? And that's where that scene ends. And like, scenes don't have to end on dialogue, obviously. This is actually a problem that I have. I tend to always end scenes on dialogue. I need to be more expository sometimes when it is called for. And so in this case, like, you are ending the scene just like if it were in text, describing this extremely intense visual image. Instead, we get to see it. And when we break to the next scene, that image is going to stay with us. And by having that be the last image that we see, and also by having it be flames made of human body parts, that is something that is being given a great deal of meaning. And so, like, that is something that a scene change does. It, like, puts more meaning on those words. That's something that a chapter ending does. It puts more meaning on those, on that thing, whatever that thing is when you end. And also, like, you want to get to somewhere poignant. And that, going back to that scene with Sam where he ends, like, may I, or whatever he says at the end there, that's such a, like, you are leaving it at a very high emotional state when you transition. And that keeps people in this elevated place where it's going to carry you through. So, like, we've ended on a high, and we're going to carry you through the establishing shots and the transition and figuring out, like, where we're at now, and your mind is doing all these things before the sort of meat of the next scene starts up. And then finally, our last scene of Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 1 has no words. It is made entirely of significant glances and stares and gazes. And it's great. And it works. There's so much staring in this show when you start to pay attention. Just the drama. And like, also because a lot of these characters are seeing each other for the very first time. Like in this situation, like, for a very long time, and since a very big deal occurred, at least in one of their lives, though it didn't seem like a big deal in his life. Oh, God, Jaime's come a long way, huh? That whole end of the episode is like, now think about the dynamic here, and remember this thing that happened in the first season, in the first book, and the path that these two characters have been on since they last saw each other is a lot to think about, but it's also like, it's very look-backy. So it's very like, remember all of the things that happened rather than drive forward. But we did just end a scene. So we had like these last two scenes. The scene previous ended with like the White Walkers are coming, and now they've just reinforced their army. So that's driving forward the main plot. And then we've got this like final stinger micro scene with no words. That's just sort of the, it's a little bit fan service to be like, it's finally happening, but it's a little bit like, I think it probably creates a really good narrative arc. So we have the great revelation of Jon Snow, and then we have the continuation of the main villain of the story, the White Walkers. And then you have this human moment between this person who was a bit of an inhuman monster and now has become more human, and someone who was very, very human, just a boy, and who has become unhuman. I mean, you take this thing apart and you start to see why people like it so much. It's really well done. So I hope that this was illustrative. It certainly was for me. But as constructors of stories, we get to choose when that ends, and we get to choose what sticks with people. And sometimes that thing is a question that you are asking to Jon Snow. At first, why have you made this choice? And at second, what is the choice that you will make with this new information? And that, of course, being one of the great tensions of this season, are questions that remained unanswered, which I think is really interesting, that we had those two scenes with unanswered questions, not answered by Jon Snow, left for all of us to think about until episode 2. I'm excited.